Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen, and I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, it seems like foreign and economic policy from the United States is always the carrot and the stick. It's either tariffs, sanctions, do what we want, or we're going to make your life a living hell. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for stopping by for discussion today. And today we're going to touch upon the Trump administration's tariff policies.
Yes, well, thank you for joining and me today as well. It's always a pleasure to get together. And yeah, we thought this was interesting because there was a statement came out from, and forgive me, I can't remember the guy's first name, Bessent, who's going to be the US Treasury Secretary, basically. And he came out with a statement when asked the question really about tariffs. And there's a lot of speculation and less speculation and almost mere fact that Trump's going to use this as a weapon to some degree. To what extent is not clear at this point in time, with particularly the Chinese, particularly the Europeans, and frankly, anywhere in the world that runs a trade surplus with the United States is earmarked for Trump's tariff treatment, which, of course, is failed spectacularly the first time around with China. And we thought we'd initially focus on the fact of what Besson said. Do you know? I can't. Do you know his first name, Ken? Because
I think it's Steve, but I
okay.
can find
Anyway,
that.
if it's not Steve, I apologize. But anyway, so the first thing, obviously, he was sort of talking about
Scott. I'm sorry, Scott.
Scott. Well, okay. Apologies, Scott Besson, for calling you Steve, but could be worse. Um, and it was talking really just about when he was asked about tariffs and what his position on this was. I mean, and he talked about how tariffs 40 to 50% of the tariff is recovered in currency appreciation. I'm not exactly sure. But he says historically, I'm not exactly sure. I would agree that with that assessment. But basically, the gist of what he's saying is, well, we've kind of realized that endless tariffs, rather like endless sanctions, you get to the point, everyone finds ways around it. It's not conducive to a long term solution. And he said, if you keep firing weapons too much with tariffing everyone, who wants access to the US market, it's just detrimental. So at least it's an encouraging sign that finally there's a recognition that we can't go full throttle on this. I mean, whether Trump has any different ideas, I don't know. But when you start to assess what he's suggesting they do, it's as equally extremely unlikely because in essence, it looks like one of those familiar stories, and it's always been Trump's beef with nations who run huge trade surpluses with the US. He thinks it should be balanced out so that trade surplus doesn't exist. Now, there's an argument to say from a US perspective, we absolutely agree with that assessment. But how do you implement it is an entirely different matter. And trying to kind of, I wouldn't say cajole China into it, but what they think they can do is over a period of time, they want to try and get Chinese people to buy more stuff domestically that isn't exported to the United States. So therefore, less goods turn up in the US. Therefore, that helps to close the trade deficit between China and the United States. And in the process, of course, China should import more goods from the United States. And, we're not saying we can do this overnight. It's like a 10-year project. We have to do it over a period of time. We're not going to sit there and expect miracles. And of course, in an ideal world, that sounds wonderful. But in practice and in reality, it's not going to happen because here's the problem. What he's not understanding is China, for the Chinese market, they are now producing much more high quality goods, which don't get exported. necessary to the rest of the world, and certainly not to the United States that people in China are consuming. So the kind of goods that would go to the United States is not necessarily goods that the people in China want particularly. To some extent, that's true. I'm not dismissing it and saying it's not the case, because it is to some extent. But the issue will always come back to this point. To say it's going to take 10 years is not realistic. It could take 20 years. It might, of course, never happen, because you have this problem once again. The United States needs to reindustrialize, and we're not going to labor this point too much, but that is an enormous undertaking. And, again, it's back to the mathematical impossibility podcast we did, where the United States doesn't have the money to build the infrastructure, can't pay Chinese wages, can't be competitive enough to be an export market. Because the bottom line is, the goods in the future that the United States could export to China, well, China can produce them a lot cheaper internally. If you're saying to the Chinese, well, what we'd like you to do is stimulate your internal market more, so you're exporting less to us. Yeah, but by exporting less to the United States, and they change to producing more high quality goods, they're giving the Chinese people domestically what they want. They don't need to import from the United States. And that's assuming, of course, the United States could produce it at the same cost as China does, which they can't. So the idea you can address this issue of this imbalance in trade between the two countries by telling China to throttle our export to us, the United States, and in the meantime, please import more from us, and over a 10-year period, we're going to close the gap. Well, how many years is it going to take for the United States to actually be able to reindustrialize in a manner that means they can be competitive? And also not just in terms of external markets and exporting, but what it means internally for the United States. Because the argument is, again, if they were to able to achieve their objectives and to be able to produce goods that are competitive, then what's going to happen is China's exports to the United States would dry up, largely because the US would then be producing things themselves. So you'd end up in a situation where, if this was feasible, what they're suggesting, China's exports to the United States would fall considerably, assuming this was a viable option. And the United States wouldn't really be exporting that much to China either. So it wouldn't. All it would do is not actually address any problems that would be beneficial to either country, because, of course, that's a hypothesis that's not reality. I'm just trying to illustrate the absurdity of what happens. It certainly would impact China to some extent, but again, remember, China's exports to the US only accounts for 3% of its annual GDP, so it can easily do without exporting anything to the United States. But the only scenario that works is a scenario where the United States can't reindustrialize the way they anticipate, because, again, they haven't bothered listening to our podcast that explains why things are mathematically impossible to do all the things they want to do. So I appreciate the sentiment, and I appreciate it's at least a step in the right direction to say this is a long-term project, but it's not as easy even to do it in 10 years. And the problem is, in the process, you're starting to try and make demands on the Chinese, and China's going to go, hang on a minute. You don't dictate to us how we trade with you. As China's always said to the United States, if you want access to our markets like other countries in the world, produce goods that our people in China will buy. That's the law of supply and demand. It's how free markets work. And dare we use the word free markets, but that's in principle how it works. And the door's always open. But if you can't produce the goods that people want in China, well, they're not going to buy them. I mean, that's the other point. What do they think? China's just going to buy whatever stuff the US wants to export. So, okay, it's a step in the right direction, but fundamentally, the US has to sit down with the Chinese and go, look, we have got a huge problem. you know we've got a problem, and we know we've got a huge problem, and we'd like you to help us with it. Well, here's the thing, US, stop trying to build military bases in the Asia Pacific and stop trying to antagonize and cajole China into invading Taiwan. Just give up your military ambitions, save all that money, invest it where it's needed in the United States. Get around the table, have a sensible discussion with the Chinese, and you could work out something that might not take 10 years to achieve. But yes, it's a big ask, and it's going to be a big change for the United States. But I think the likes of Besant knows this has to happen. And of course, it's very difficult in his position. He might be thinking exactly what we're saying, but he can't be in a position to say it because it sounds, if you're a politician or in that position, not. It sort of sounds very bad from the US perspective. But yeah, it's a start, but it's not the answer to the US's problems.
No, and that's a good overlay of what the U.S. tariff, at least the Trump tariff policy, wants to do. But the reality is that the it appears more than anything, sanctions and tariffs are the stick that the U.S. government and especially the Trump administration wants to push to try to get other nations to bend to their will. Take Mexico, for example. Okay. Mexico didn't really have any intention, especially under the Biden administration, to close the borders. So, there was no need. And something else, the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, she came out yesterday or the day before in a rousing speech and pretty much said, you know what? The companies like GM, Stellantis, uh, et cetera, Ford, they've been in Mexico for 80 years. So if you're going to put these tariffs on Mexico, you're putting the tariffs on your own companies. And those costs inside the US are already outrageous compared for what the consumer needs to buy. And you're going to add an additional 15, 20%, 10% onto that. They're not going to be purchasing their own American goods. And when you take a look at GDP, the largest portion of GDP outside of consumer spending is hospitality and healthcare. So you're talking, we have fast food joints, we have bars, and we have the big hospital system. That's not productivity. I mean, if you take a look at the largest market cap companies, they're all big tech, which has limited really industrial production. We have big pharma, which is just feeding the medicals. What do we have to offer?
Well, yeah, and you have to also look at the thing because of previous US policies. You know, the Chinese used to get a lot of soybeans from the United States. They're now getting from Brazil. So some of the markets where the US benefited because of their behavior and their attitude towards sanctioning or potentially sanctioning and tariffs means countries are going, well, we'd much rather trade with the likes of Brazil because we don't have the threat of them sanctioning us. Or, we have an agreement because the United States can't be trusted and reneges on every agreement it ever makes. Then we don't trust you. And it's interesting, Besant does make this point when he talks about sanctions. And he says, because we have the dollar, we can put sanctions on countries and the US gets extra territorial control. And he says, so we can tell the French you can't trade with Iran because we control the dollar. But over time, people then leave the dollar because if you keep firing that weapon, that's exactly what's going to happen. So at least I think that's an encouraging sign that's I'm sure Besant's not the only one who recognizes and understands the futility of sanctions and having this kind of draconian, onerous attitude to the entire world who doesn't agree with them, because ultimately it's blowing up in their face and de-dollarization is a reality. I know there's people who believe in the dollar and just won't accept reality, but that's irrelevant. And frankly, who cares, because it's a reality that's undeniable. And yeah, this is the problem. You have to find a situation where the US has to accept that there might be US companies, who are currently better off being in Mexico, better off being in China. Dare I say it, better off being in Russia. Not, I'm trying to make a point that, and really there might be a halfway house situation for the United States, who could say, well, if we have US companies in these countries and they produce goods which they can kind of quasi export to the United States, well, let's get a deal that's very conducive to those exports, where they can produce goods that we can sell in the domestic market. US companies can profit from having overseas businesses, of course, not domestically, because they can't produce a widget in the United States for anywhere near the same cost as they can in Mexico or China, etc., or somewhere in Southeast Asia, and find some compromises and halfway house between the ultimate solution, which they want to reindustrialize. You know what? I'd like the United States to reindustrialize. I can remember being young and buying things that said "Made in USA" written on them. How often do you see that now? I mean, and so it would be great in the long term for us, but they're going to have to make a lot of sacrifices along the way. They're going to have to go, well, does having a world reserve currency matter when we've been weaponizing it and no one trusts us? What do we need to do to stimulate, real economic growth in the country? And, there's a kind of bitter irony when you talk about hospitality, because people go to bars and drink too much. They go to fast food joints and eat too much, sort of garbage food. And where do they end up over a long period of time? In hospitals, because it's detrimental to their long-term health and well-being. And there's a kind of bitter irony to the process. But, again, if you strip down the US's productive economy, it's very small, and it needs to be significantly higher. And therefore, they're going to have to realize at some point, yes, we are weaponizing the dollar. Yes, we shouldn't continue to make policy decisions that upsets the rest of the world. And, what can we do that will be advantageous? And we might have to, swallow some, eat some humble pie, or have to make some decisions that stick in our throat. But the US is, I think, increasingly, there seems to be noises coming out of the Beltway. There's certainly noises about the future Trump administration, that the US is drinking at the last chance saloon. It either starts to get its ducks lined up, starts to rectify some of the problems, because very soon the problems will become 100-fold worse. But the big part of that is to regain trust in the world, and to be seen as a reliable partner who the world wants to work with. Because, the US being a great nation amongst equals, how many times have we said that, would be a major benefit to the world. But, it's also part of the re-education of Western countries like the US. And, it's interesting that there's clearly some idea that there might be a way of compromising with the Chinese. But I think part of that is because Europe has learned a very tough lesson, where they listened to the US, said, we're going to put all these tariffs on Chinese EVs. China went, fine, okay, well, here's a list of things we're going to put tariffs on with you. And they almost said, hang on, we thought we could just do it and you wouldn't respond. I mean, it's this kind of childish attitude, this gross, crass naivety. And as soon as they did that, they immediately wanted to have discussions and find a way to reach an amicable solution. And this is the point. Stop being aggressive. Stop this Western bullying tactic, particularly for Europe and the United States to be as weak as they are, and realize you don't need to do that. The modern world is not about this. It's about win-win cooperation and finding ways that the US can have some sort of transition over a period of time, and they can start to manufacture things domestically. But again, the big problem is you have to get rid of financialization, and getting rid of financialization is the end of Wall Street as it is now, and financial institutions. Now, you try and grapple with those and convince them that their gravy train's over, and that's going to be very difficult, but that's the harsh reality.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because you take a look at the newest data coming out. U.S. durable goods down minus 0.2%. I mean, it might seem as small, but three of the last four quarters has seen a negative decline. So not only are they not selling durable goods, something of actual industrial production in the U.S., it's not being bought by the world. And a great comparison is to take a look at the EV cars. They are showcasing in China at the car shows the this wonderful Chinese EV for between 20 and 30,000 US dollars. Compare that to Tesla, which has had to rely upon credits, EV credits, to bring its price down to the 35 to 80,000 range. And then, of course, GM, their flagship regular car isn't the $80,000 point. Their trucks are over $100,000. They can't compete. And their quality is a joke. Their battery life is pathetic. So why would the world want to buy any of this stuff when we can't even produce it with quality anymore? And we just have so few industries, in a sense, it's a return to mercantilism, but we don't have anything really we're trying to protect. And that's where, the whole tariff game is uh, not just detrimental because it's going to increase prices for domestic, consumers domestically, but there's not a darn thing that we produce outside of energy, and in many cases we're trying to force that onto the Europeans, but there's very few things we produce that the world wants. So what are you protecting your industry from? So in the long run, it's not just a matter of the US is going to have to come as an equal partner. Unless we actually have something that we can bring to the table, the world's not even going to want us at the table. There's no point.
No, it's a great point, and it's a very sobering, salient kind of reality that the US is going to have to face in the future. Yeah, what do they produce that the world wants? It is back to the whole issue. Europe has a stark choice. Let's buy US energy for as long as that lasts. And again, we're back to the claims that I'm increasingly hearing that the US is going to have reach peak energy very soon, as opposed to, well, you can buy it from the Russians for the next 100 years, no problem. Regular supply, dirt cheap in comparison. In the end, economic reality is going to hit home, because otherwise Europe's going to be a deindustrialized wasteland, which it increasingly is, simply not entirely, but in very simple terms, just because they don't have access to cheap energy. So being forced and cajoled into buying US energy, I mean, this is something the Trump administration might do and threaten them with tariffs if they don't. But in the end, it doesn't benefit the Europeans in any way, shape, or form. So there comes a point when you completely gut a continent, someone's going to turn around eventually and go, enough's enough. And then the US's position will be one of, well, there's this huge global South world that we want to trade with. From the Europeans' perspective, if you want to keep trying to, to cajole us or bully us into buying your energy on your terms, well, this isn't going to continue. And, the US is going to have to find a way to stop doing this. But the problem is, what's the alternative? Because if you're given the opportunity to buy Russian energy for, a third of the cost, a fifth of the cost, whatever it is, then the US has, as you said, Ken, absolutely nothing to offer. So it has to find ways of having things that the world wants from a partner that it trusts and finds reliable. And at the moment, the US is nowhere near capable of manufacturing a widget that the rest of the world is prepared to pay that price, and is the same quality or better quality than what the rest of the world's already producing, simply because the world doesn't know at this point in time, because the US is producing next to nothing. You can't have a promise of producing a widget at the same price and the same quality until people see the goods, in the whites of their eyes, so to speak. Then it's just a pipe dream. And this is the problem. It's at least finally a recognition of a long-standing problem that's happened really since the deindustrialization in the United States started, bit in the 80s, 90s through the 2000s, and handing the baton to China, who said, "Thank you very much. That's very kind of you." But fundamentally, these are the problems the US has to address, and the whole tariff story is going to apply to the world, because Trump's attitude is, we have a trade deficit with you, you're in our sights. Well, sorry, Donald, that's not how it's going to work in the future. You have to learn to have humility, and you need to learn to be regarded as a trustworthy partner and be a great nation amongst equals. And then the world will be banging the US's door down to trade with them. It's quite simple.
I think there's one final quick point I want to push on this. Trump is threatened tariffs on both China and Mexico regarding the drug war. As I said, the stick, just like sanctions. Interestingly enough, I was reminded of prohibition, and the Mexican president made a great point. You know what? We wouldn't be pushing drugs through the country, or the cartels wouldn't be doing it, if America didn't have an appetite for drugs. And during the time of Prohibition, when they outlawed the sale and distribution of alcohol, guess what? People wanted to drink, period. And it led to the rise of the gangs and the bootlegging and a lot of criminal activity that tore apart the cities. So people want their vices, their sin drug, sin taxes, the whole nine yards. So is it really a matter of the going after the drug cartels, because the drug cartels have been force feeding drugs and fentanyl, whatever, into people? Or is it the fact that the American people have a problem that they need or want and can't stop taking illicit narcotics? So the old saying is if you cut off one source, another one will come fill the vacuum. So it doesn't matter. So that point of the tariffs going after China and Mexico is absolutely moot if the people themselves won't stop taking these narcotics.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to stop. So,
absolutely. Paul, as always, thank you for your insight and for being a part of this great discussion.
And likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for all of your support. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, comment, pass this on to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.